is an important day. I wish that there were more. I wish that there were more coverage about this than it seems to be getting. But we're here, and we're going to focus and study and learn about this. Now, my task is to talk a little bit about the history of slavery. And I need to start by saying that, give you a disclaimer. Some of the material I want to share with you can be a little disturbing. I notice there's some of the young people in the room, and what I'm going to be sharing is a lot of the testimonies of slaves, telling it like it is.
All right.
It's not very fun. It's not pretty. Some of it's very disturbing. So a disclaimer, if you feel like the young people aren't capable of internalizing this, perhaps you might need to step out. But slavery is not a pretty thing. Now, I kind of feel a little awkward, a white man standing here in front of a predominantly black audience. But I can tell you this, one of the things that the research shows, we look at the 1870 census, we see that 1 out of every 3 persons of color was indicated by the census taker as mulatto, which meant they were mixed race. And you think about what that means. That means that this 1870, just 5 years after slavery ended, right? It meant that there was a lot of miscegenation, interaction between the races. And I can tell you this about my own genealogical study, my own family history. I am descended from African Americans myself. I know I probably don't suffer the consequences of that because of my skin color and the privileges that it brings me. But I can say this too about the people in this room. My guess is, given the history of this country, that not everybody in here is pure black or pure white. There's a lot of mixing of the races at the time. My brother Dave Delarme, I believe, is going to talk about that a little bit more in detail a little later. So one of the aspects of this issue of slavery, of what I call the residue of slavery, is something that we all need to be conscious of, whether we have white skin or black skin. Most likely, if you do a little bit of genealogy, you'll find that in America, most blacks who have been here for a while descend from some white blood as well. So we kind of share common ancestries to that end at some level. What I want to do is instead of me telling you about slavery, I want to share with you some testimonies from slaves. Now, what happened was, in the 1930s, during the Depression, President Roosevelt was trying to really give everybody a job, mostly with the federal government. One of the things that he wanted to do was to get narratives, to get firsthand testimonies of people who had been in slavery. It was the 1930s, and these people were very elderly at this time. Those who had been in slavery were 80, 90 years old. So he felt like before they were gone and could no longer be documented, I want to send people down to find as many slaves or ex-slaves at the time as they could to interview them and to write down their stories. And so we have a collection of what are called the Works Progress Administration, the WPA slave narratives. Thousands and thousands of them. They're available, they're public domain, they're on the internet, they're at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And I'd like to show you some of those testimonies. Now, when the journalists went down to interview the slaves, they were given instructions to write down the words the way they heard them spoken. So most of the testimonies are, I don't know if you want to call it misspelled, but they're spelled the way that they heard the ex-slaves speaking. And that's why you'll look up here as you see some of these words, and you'll say, Gardner doesn't know how to spell. And I'm just putting it out there the way it was provided to the journalists at the time. Now, I want to start, before I get into the slave narratives, I want to start by addressing, I believe it was our invocator's comment, that the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1, 1863 didn't free the slaves. Indeed, that's correct. As a matter of fact, what happened in late 1862, the president, Mr. Lincoln, was very concerned that the war wasn't going his way. And he was trying to figure out some way to turn the tide. He was having a lot of ministers come to the White House and say to him, "Sir, the problem is that you're not on God's side. You're not making this issue of slavery. You're keeping it, preserve the Union, preserve democracy." And so Lincoln, in August of 1862, knelt on his knees in the White House and said, "Lord, if you will protect me from Robert E. Lee, who's coming to get me as we speak, then I will issue an Emancipation Proclamation." Right after that came the Battle of Antietam, where Robert E. Lee was prevented from entering into Washington, D.C. Lincoln felt like he had to honor his commitment to God, and on January 1st, 1863, he issued an Emancipation Proclamation of slaves, not slaves that existed in the Union states, in Maryland, in Kentucky, Missouri, parts of Western Virginia, but only the slaves that existed in the states that were currently in rebellion, namely the Confederacy. In other words, the Emancipation only emancipated slaves that Lincoln really didn't have any control over. And so there really wasn't any emancipation at that time. It didn't happen until the war was over. And he justified it as a war measure. In other words, in the United States, the president doesn't make the laws. He can't do that. But he said, as commander-in-chief, I'm doing this as a war measure, and once the war ended, the Emancipation Proclamation could have easily been overturned. So they needed an amendment to the Constitution to end slavery, which occurred on December 6, 1865, exactly 150 years ago today. So the Emancipation Proclamation was really only freeing slaves on paper. Not a whole lot of slaves were freed as the result of that. And we think about Lincoln as the great emancipator of the slaves, and that's a little bit skewed. Although he did have something to do with this amendment, as you've seen the movie by Spielberg. He pushed for this amendment very strongly before the end of his life. Okay, well now let me get to these narratives here, and remote control here, I think this is going to work. I want to start by showing you the way things were in slavery prior to the 13th Amendment, and then talking about the ways in which they have changed. But I want to also focus on the ways in which things have not changed as much as they should have at this point. I want to start with talking about how men, black males, were regarded before the 13th Amendment. Now, these slave narratives, what they did, they basically had a journalist, like even in Columbus, would come down and interview. This next one is a man by the name of Rheus Bodie. He lived in Columbus, he had been a slave, and he told this story. He talked about going down to the auction block on 1225 Broadway, right here in town. There were many slave auctions right here in Columbus. But look what he says here about the men. Rheus Bodie had 12 brothers, 8 of whom were big buck slaves, older than themselves. The planters and patrollers, those are patrollers, people to prevent people from running away, accorded the big slaves unusual privileges to the end that they have estimated they was the daddies of at least 100 head of children. In other words, if you were a big black male, you could go out at night and you could go to any slave quarter you wanted. You could visit all the women. They encouraged it. Encouraged the big men to visit the women. And each of these men had approximately 100 children. 100 children. And some of these children were scattered over the area. Go to another one here. Here's another fellow, ex-slave, L.H. Davidson. Master, he bring me some more women to see me. He wouldn't let me have just one woman. I have 15 women. And I don't know how many children. Now, what does this mean about these men actually being fathers? Certainly biologically fathers. But they weren't permitted to be fathers in the sense of role modeling, of being there to provide discipline, of being there to provide fatherhood. A good price for a slave, $1,500. On down, if one was what was called a stallion, he was a stud, his price went way up to $2,500. Another slave said this. If an owner had a big woman slave and she had a little man for her husband, not a big black man, but a little man, but her owner had a big man slave, they would make the woman's little husband leave, they bring in the woman and let a big man be with her so that her children would be big, so they would sell them well. These slave owners were using men almost as genetic engineering to try to create big, strong bucks in that sense. During slavery, if one master had a big boy, another had a big gal, the masters make them be together. They raise children to sell just like we raise pigs to sell. This is a woman, Louisa Everett, giving her testimony. Marshal Jim called me and Sam to him and ordered Sam to pull off his shirt. He said to me, "Now, do you think you can stand this big slave?" So I said, "Yes, sir, I guess so." I tried to hide my face so I couldn't see his nakedness, but he made me look at him. And he told us we must get busy and do it in his presence. And we had to do it. After that, we were considered man and wife. We were big, strong, so I didn't have any other men forced on me, thank God. He lined up the women on one side, and this is at the slave auction block, and a buyer would walk up and down to the rows, grab a woman, make sure she's strong, a good breeder, and then the buyer would pick out a strong young boy. And then they'd get them home, and they'd say, "You guys get together. I want you to produce offspring." Denzel Washington, some of you have seen the movie, The Great Debaters, talks about a systematic way in which the slave owners destroy slave families. They did it by taking away their sense of confidence, largely from the males. They took it away from the males. They would take the black males away from the family and keep the men moving and working. If a slave female with female offspring would teach her to be like herself, independent and negotiable, but one with a male offspring, he'd be raised to be mentally dependent and weak, but physically big and strong, right? And if you remember the movie, the idea was keep the body strong, destroy the mind. Keep the body strong, destroy the mind. This was systematic. So I want to ask now about 13th Amendment comes along, and slavery's gone, right? So all of these issues should be gone. Well, here's what we see in sociology, in psychology, in the studies of genograms, that we get these patterns of behavior, and they're hard to shake off. And so the 13th Amendment comes along, and you think, okay, we're not going to have this issue with the absentee males anymore. Well, what does the 13th Amendment say? Slavery is abolished, except, right? Except where the party is duly convicted. Isn't that? Duly convicted. Well, we know that after the Civil War, a lot of black males were executed without being duly convicted. Because if you think about it this way, the 13th Amendment, when it was written in 1865, this was a loophole really to keep slavery going. We can keep these men in slavery. All we have to do is cook a little jury and get them duly convicted. And then we could put them back basically on the farms. Because they would lease out the slaves back to the farmers. See? So, and they're keeping the men. Somebody put on the back of this piece here, you think about it. The prison population today, or maybe a couple of years ago, 73% black male. You know, in the general population, there's only 7% black male. There's 10 times more black males in prison than in the regular population. Now, what is that about? How could that be? Something's wrong. Because if we believe, as I do, that all human beings are essentially equal in terms of their moral propensity, we should have 7% of black males in prison, not 73%. You see what I'm saying? Because unless we bite the bullet and say, well, we'll just be racist, then well, the problem is there must be more evil. It must be more criminal. No, something's wrong with the system. And the 13th Amendment left that loophole open so that we could keep black males the same way that this person wanted them to be. Keep them away from their families. Because if you don't have a black male in the family as a father providing fatherly guidance, you're going to have one more generation, next one, the next one, the next one, and the next one's going to happen. Bad stuff. All right, moving on to the mothers. Let me give you some testimonies from slave women. And again, this is not pleasant. This is disturbing. Actually, Thomas Jefferson, our third president, said that the women were the crop of his farm. I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years more profitable than the best man on the farm. What she produces is in addition to the capital, while his labors disappear in the consumption. He's just picking cotton. She's giving us more slaves. See? And so it's not their labor, but their increase, which is the first consideration with us planters. The farms in Virginia, they weren't raising tobacco and cotton as much as they were raising human crop. Wow. And the women who were the breeders, they called them breeders. Frederick Douglass said the same thing. One of his masters brought a woman as a breeder. Then he went out and rented a big married slave, and he used to make them fasten up every night so that they would have big, populous offspring. Fannie Moore, a female slave, said the breeding woman always bring more money than the rest, even the men. When they put her on the block, they put children all around her to show folks how quickly she could have children. Sometimes she had colored children, sometimes she had white children. Ain't no use to say anything, because if she does, she'd get whipped. Why? On the Moore plantation, Aunt Cheney, everybody called her Aunt Cheney, had 2 children by the overseer. The overseer's name was Hill. He was as mean as the devil. Many boys and girls end up marrying their own brothers and sisters because they never know the difference, unless they get to be talking about who their parents are and where they used to live. They'd buy a fine girl and a fine man, just put them together like cattle. They wouldn't stop to marry them. If she was a good breeder, they was proud of her. I was stout, and they were saving me for a breeding woman. By the time I was free, I was free. There was another man in Nashville. He had a regular farm of slaves. He just raised them to sell. Do you know there were certain municipalities that had laws that said once a woman had 15 children, she could be freed? There's a little incentive. Have as many babies as you possibly can. And if you do, you get your freedom. That's awful, terrible. According to Mammy Dink, she's from Columbus, by the way, every time a Negro baby was born on one of his plantations, Major Dalton gave them a calico dress and a bright, shiny silver dollar. So why do I bring all this up? Women, young black women, were encouraged to have offspring very, very youngly, very, very in their youth, before the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment came and all this changes, right? No. We still have a disproportionately high offspring rate of black women compared to white women. Then we still have this system whereby some black women believe, and perhaps for good reasons, that if I just have a lot of children, they'll give me a lot of stuff. I'll get food stamps, I'll get this, I'll get that, and I'll get the other thing. So this system hasn't changed with the 13th Amendment entirely. All these things, that stuff didn't come out after the 13th Amendment. It was there before the 13th Amendment started. All this system.
Yes, sir.
Large families were the aim and pride of the slave owner. He quickly learned which one of the slave women were the breeders. A slave trader could always sell a breeding woman for twice the usual amount. All right, miscegenation, real quickly on this piece. Wow, again, my ancestors, some of your ancestors. My master was, to my knowledge, the father of 11 slaves. My master was a white man. He had 11 slave children. Did the mothers dare to tell the slave women? No. No way, except in whispers, they knew too well the consequences. Talks about when they were 14 or 15, they started to get raped. A white man thinks of nothing of putting a colored man out to field work and carries on with the colored man's wife at the same time. Slave William Anderson. Why is George so white? Because his master was a white gentleman named Mr. Jimmy Dunn. His mommy was a woman named Frances Mason, and his master was his Paul. Yes, ma'am, I see you're surprised, but that happened a lot in those days. I hear tell of a white man that would tell his sons, go down to the slave quarters and make some more slaves. In those times, white men went with colored girls and women boldly. Anytime one saw a woman, she had to go with him. His wife couldn't say nothing about it. Not only the men, but the women went with the colored men too. We get down here. There was this one woman, she had one white lady who lived near us at McBean, slipped in a colored girl's room and cut her baby's head clean off Why? Because it belonged to her own husband. But he kept going with the colored woman. They had more children. One day, this was told by his master that if his wife had been a good looking, I would never sleep with her again because he'd kill me and take her and raise children off her. They used to take women away from their husbands and put them with some other man just to breed like they would do cattle. This is ugly, ugly sorts of things. Slave farms. In Virginia, they said that the chief economic resource in the border states was slaves. Well, I'm going to stop just there for a brief minute and go to one other issue that continues to have residue today that's a real problem, and that is education. Prior to the 13th Amendment, in most southern municipalities, it was against the law for a white person or a black person to try to become educated. For a white person to try to educate a black person, or for a black person to try to educate themselves. So we had a systematic way of keeping down the black population simply by preventing education. 13th Amendment came along, and supposedly all that has changed. Friends, I'm going to tell you it hasn't. It has not changed entirely. I work in the education department at CSU. We can clearly identify, we have black schools and white schools, whether we like it or not. We have de facto segregation. And in certain schools, the resources aren't there. The finances aren't there. The facilities aren't there. And more importantly, this idea of keeping the men weak and dependent and taking away their confidence continues in the schools today here in Columbus. I go into schools to watch student teachers teach. And I give you a couple of anecdotes that illustrate this profoundly. I went into this one school a couple years ago watching my student, talked to him after he was done. I said, Greg, great job, brother, but you let those three young men in the back of the corner, you let them fall asleep. You can't let those men fall asleep. He looked at me, he was kind of sad. He said, well, Dr. Gardner, you have to understand, the principal of this school has instructed us, let those boys sleep because they're going to prison anyway. Wow. And if we wake those boys up, they'll just interfere with the good kids who have good parents. See? We call it the school to prison pipeline. And it really exists. It exists. I go into another school, and I say to the young man, it's at Carver High School, I said, Ashad, great job. You did a great job, man. I love the way that you have energy and you just smiled, but you were teaching what we call mostly lower order skills, memorizations and just facts and dates. I want to see you challenge these kids to do some critical thinking. The teacher sitting over in the corner, the permanent teacher, looks at me and says, Dr. Gardner, this is Carver. These kids are not capable of critical thinking. Wow. Wow. And those kids hear that. I stood up at the end of the class and I said, I was talking about my student teacher. I said, I'm from Columbus State and I'm here to watch this young man teach. I said, how many of y'all heard of Columbus State? Hands raised. How many of y'all want to go to college or going to go to college? Just a couple. Out of maybe 25 or 30. I looked at them and said, what's up with that? Why don't you want to go to college? And 2 or 3 of them pointed to their teacher and said, we're too stupid to go to college. Just ask our teacher. He tells us every day. Wow. Every day. That's the systematic keeping down, just like Denzel Washington was saying, robbing the people of their dignity, of their confidence. They might have strong, healthy body. If I raise my hand, I say, okay, raise your hand. How many of you are going to go into pro sports? I get a bunch of them raise their hand. I got a strong body. I could tackle somebody. I could play some basketball. But going to college? No, I'm too stupid for that.
Keep it up.
You see, so the 13th Amendment has changed things officially. But wow, there's a lot of residue left over. There's a YouTube, I challenge you to look it up, of a teacher telling, he's in an all-black school, and he's telling these young men that all they're good for is breeding. He's telling his own kids that. And I said, and he's trying to use the reverse psychology approach. I'm gonna criticize them. Hopefully they'll try to prove me wrong. So I call him all kinds of names. He swears at them, that kind of thing. But the problem is, he got that. I asked my students when they watch that video, I say, how many people think that teacher would keep their job at Brookstone High School, which is an affluent white? He would never keep it. Never keep it there. Well, they say, well, you don't understand. That's in the ghetto, and this is what they have to say. So you know what? Maybe it's just the opposite way around. Maybe if you wouldn't disrespect somebody at Brookstone, don't disrespect them at Carver or Spencer at Kendrick. Have the same amount of respect, and maybe that's when things will change. Maybe that's when things will change. Okay, I don't think I want to press on this too much longer. I know that Brother Johnny's got a lot to talk about. But I guess what I want to say a couple things just in ending. When the 13th Amendment kicked in, a lot didn't change officially. The majority of slaves who was living in their slave quarters, the next year, were still living in those same slave quarters. They were no longer called slaves, they were called sharecroppers. Right? But nothing really changed. If anything changed, they were actually getting less provided for than they were prior. Because now they're just getting a percentage. And what do they know about percentages? They haven't been allowed to learn math. They don't know that sort of thing. So you're getting a share. You're getting a percentage of the crop. Well, here's your 5%. How do I know that's what I deserve? And now I'm not getting fed. I'm not being able to be provided for. Many of these work progress administration testimony will say what sounds terrible, but if you think about it, it makes sense. They'll say, you know what? We were better off before the 13th Amendment. We were better off. Because after the 13th Amendment, when we were no longer owned, the master no longer had any value in keeping us. And if the KKK came along and you got lynched or killed or whatever, the owner wouldn't stand up for us. Prior to that, the owner said, you lay off of that man. He's a valuable piece of property to me. Now, after the 13th Amendment, Reconstruction was bad. It was ugly. And those times, there was no due process. They were, I think maybe you'll hear it from Johnny, they were just putting these black men in prison just for standing on the corner loitering. See? We'll put you in prison. Now you have been duly convicted. Now the 13th Amendment no longer applies to you. And we can lease you back to a farmer. You're not going to get paid for it, but you're going basically back to slavery. And do you think that's going on today? My brother came up here a minute ago and said, do you think that the police officers are deliberately bringing these men in order to make money off of it? Maybe not all of them, but I wonder some of them might be. You know, there's money to be made. I don't know if you saw in the program, there's millions of dollars in the prison industry. And not just making prisons, but leasing. They're still leasing prisoners out. That prison lease system still exists. So I'm happy that we're celebrating the official end of slavery. But what I want to say to you is, we need to be informed. We need to, education is the way to see. When you see that things haven't really changed, that's when you're empowered to say, I can do something about this. You know, it hasn't really changed as much as we think. I'm tired of, I have a lot of conservative friends, and what they say to me on a regular basis, Gardner, could you please stop talking about slavery? And stop blaming everything on slavery. It's gone. Everybody has an equal opportunity today. So just stop talking about it. It's just not the reality, friends. History leaves a deep impact. The way that you were raised reflects the way that your children are raised, and vice versa. And the way that that teacher was raised, who was cussing at his students, reflects the way that he was raised. And if you take that back, it's going to go back to an overseer who was basically saying the same thing to him that he's saying to his kids now, you're no good for anything but breeding. Where did that originate? It originated with the overseer. It originated with the planter owners. And somebody's got to put a stop to that cycle. Please. Thank you.